Welcome and thank you for attending the Black History Matters series presented by the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. My name is Victoria Basurto and I am a current senior at Colgate University as well as an intern for the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum. I facilitated the series of 28 presentations that we released throughout this month, February 2021, and that you can view on our YouTube channel or on our website. Tomorrow, I will be concluding the Black History Matters series with a few statements of gratitude and acknowledgement to all who made Black History Matters possible. Today, I will be introducing a program that we will be hosting on our website and YouTube channel for the month of March. On March 2nd, we will be posting an episode on this same YouTube channel from the series titled Jim Stewart's Historical Tonic for Fragile White Folks, which is a series of 15 videos created by Dr. James Brewer Stewart and published on his YouTube channel. Dr. James Stewart is the founder of Historians Against Slavery and James Wallace Professor of History Emeritus at Macalester College. He has published a dozen books on the history of the American anti-slavery movement, has appeared in several of the American Experiences historical documentaries, is co-editor for Louisiana University Press of a book series on abolition, anti-slavery, and the Atlantic world, is a consultant to the Celebrate American Heroes Project, and has spoken widely on college and university campuses on abolishing slavery in Lincoln's time and ours. Throughout the 15 videos, Dr. Stewart covers a range of historical topics and the white men and women that did or did not show up in pivotal moments of American history, moments that would define the way racial relations function today, plus an analysis of what we can do moving forward. This is how I would describe the series after watching it myself. But in the words of Dr. Stewart, each video, quote, takes account of important milestones or an important symbol or an important event that happened in the past between 1865 and 1960 that involved white supremacy. This isn't African American history. This is the history of white folk. Because the fact of the matter is we show up all the time in the world of Black people, end quote. Dr. James Stewart has been very active with the National Abolition Hall of Fame and Museum in the past, and he wanted me to emphasize that he hopes his videos will encourage you to join him in further examinations of white supremacy and its remedies. He frequently participates in Zoom sessions and video conferencing with communities of faith, reading groups, and public libraries, as well as with high school and collegiate educators. To explore this possibility, email him at stewart@macalester.edu. I will now play Dr. Stewart's promotional video for the series, followed by an interview that I did with him after I finished watching the series, to gauge what motivated him to create it as well as what he hoped others would gain from it. I would recommend you rewatch this interview after you have finished the entire series, which again will be released daily throughout March on this YouTube channel, so that some of the content becomes a little bit clearer. But I believe you will find it interesting to go into the series itself, knowing some of the thought process behind the creation of the videos. So thank you, and without further ado, the promo and the interview.
I'm Jim Stewart. I'm an American historian who teaches and writes about white supremacy from my home base here at Macalester College, about 5 miles away from the George Floyd Memorial in Minneapolis. Because of what the past has taught me, I'm deathly afraid that well-meaning white people are starting to back away from demanding that Black Lives Matter. That we white folks are in danger of undermining an emerging civil rights movement just as it's getting started. It's happened before. Can we ensure that we won't repeat these tragedies? Yes, we can. If you'll join me in making a deep dive into the disturbing history of white supremacy in the United States. That dive consists of 16 beautifully produced YouTube history lessons, each only 7 to 8 minutes long. I call my videos Jim Stewart's Historical Tonic for Fragile White Folks. Each of them describes wrenching developments that usually get glossed over in the history textbooks. But that's precisely why it's so essential to know about them. They demonstrate, first of all, that you're not responsible for what happened. That's back then's problem. They also allow you to see much more clearly than you have ever seen before the tangles of white supremacy that back then has left for us. And best of all, they tell you more than you ever knew before about how to begin unwinding them. Facing up to the nation's oppressive past and owning it takes exactly the same tough-mindedness we need to push back against white supremacy today. These videos are absolutely free, no follow-up promotions, no hidden costs. Get to your laptop, your tablet, your smartphone, download them now. Jim Stewart's Historical Tonic for Fragile White Folks.
So thank you so much for giving me some of your time. The first question that I'd like to ask you is, you mentioned in the beginning of your video that this is something that you do. You study white nationalism and the history of it. I sort of wanted to get an idea of why you chose white nationalism as a historical topic, sort of what got you interested in that, and why you decided this was the aspect of history that you wanted to focus on.
Well, it's a really complicated, long personal story. And it begins in the 1950s when I was a Division I basketball player playing in the Ivy League against all white players. I'm in 19, 20, 21 years old. Graduated from Dartmouth, not up the road too far from Colgate. Went back home to Cleveland, Ohio, and discovered that all the basketball that I needed to learn was being played downtown in black rec centers. So I decided, for the love of the game and because of the civil rights movement starting to boil up around me around 1963, 64, that it was worth my while to go down to the rec centers and try and learn the new game, because the black game is much different than the game that I've been used to. So when I went into the rec centers, of course, I was the guy who was never picked. I'm the guy who's mad or out of place. I'm the guy who does not know anybody, but I'm also the white guy in the middle of an entirely black group of players. And to make a very long story short, I learned how to be othered. And in the process, began to ask a whole series of questions, personal questions and basketball related questions about where does this come from? What do I want to do about it? So forth and so on. And it turned out to be a very large struggle that I was basically succeeded in doing, is getting myself into the league and then bringing other white players in as well. And the next phase was Cleveland, Ohio, blowing up in the middle of the riots following the King assassination, after I'd been working in voter registration in Cleveland for a very long time for African Americans, where there was only one voter registration office in downtown Cleveland. And Cleveland's one of the most segregated cities that you'll ever want to live in. So I began asking the question, where did all this come from? It's a historical question, takes you immediately back to 1619. Slavery, when African people first ended up here, and so forth and so on. So I got a PhD in American history, studied the anti-slavery movement and all the opposition to it. I spent a tremendous amount of time writing and teaching about that. Do you know Graham Hodges?
The professor?
Yeah.
Yes.
He and I have known each other for about 30 years. Okay. So anyway, Graham and I are very much, I was trying to think of somebody that you could compare me to, people that are very much in the same field. And so from studying anti-slavery and studying how African-American activists were received in American culture before the Civil War, what the whole problem of slavery turned into, when it's also slavery and white racism in the free states as well as in slave states, and then how it implicates people of color from other places, like people on the Hispanic frontier and American Indians, it becomes a very complicated story that I ended up writing a tremendous amount about, getting involved in PBS productions, doing a lot of different things. Well, you've seen, I think, what my Google page looks like. And so I spent my whole life actually dealing with this question of structural white supremacy, and even wrote a big essay about the rise of white supremacy in its modern form in the North before the Civil War, which spent a lot of energy and time getting attention and having to respond to. So I've been in this business for a long time. And I retired real early when I was 62. I'm 80 now, so you can do the math, with the idea of being able to get outside the confines of Macalester College, which is very, very much like Colgate. And I felt that I really had to stretch out and start moving the interface between my scholarship and my activism in a really public direction. So in 2011, I founded a thing called Historians Against Slavery, which is all about understanding slavery and anti-slavery in an international context to understand contemporary labor oppression, human trafficking, all that kind of stuff. Then I started getting myself involved in anti-slavery and activist sportswear and clothing production, which is something we can talk about some other time. And then finally, I just decided, after I thought about it for not very much longer, that the only way that I can be effective with the knowledge in my head is to turn white privilege on its head and tell white folks who they really are. And what it means to both show up and show up despite the fact that you're not showing up. And it also occurred to me that, frankly, African-American people from the very beginning, from everything that you can read, everything you can listen to, everything you can watch, starting with Phyllis Wheatley up to Lizzo, is one giant message to white people that white people don't listen to. And so the whole business of trying to make a big bridge back out into big society again, and to take this scholarship and to, on the one hand, make it very accessible without watering it down or without being unfaithful to the scholarship itself, resulted in the videos. And now the videos are being used in lots of different places for lots of different things. And I'm on calls like this all the time, basically working out the same problem that I had in the gym and in the rec centers back in the 60s. There's just a tremendous amount of continuity in this. And it's built into sort of the center of how I think about things, write about things, worry about things. And at this age, what kind of world I'm going to leave soon?
Hopefully not.
Well, no, I mean, when you're 80, you gotta accept that. So anyway, does that answer your question?
Yeah, definitely. And I think sort of piggybacking off of that question, I did have a question sort of related to something that you said at the beginning of your videos as well, which was, you said this was a history focused about white people and not about African Americans. I know that there's a lot of conversation around the way that we teach African American history and sort of teach it as this history of peer oppression and sort of removing the agency, I think, of people who were going through this oppression, as well as their resistance. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the way that you approach this history, because you do touch upon a ton of history in your series. You talk about the Red Summer, you talk about sometimes like the era of Reconstruction, and you sort of jump around these moments in history. But I would like to think to ask you about the way that you decided to approach this, focusing on what white people did in these moments, rather than focusing on traditionally, I think, what has been like how African Americans have been oppressed in the moments.
This is a message from white folks to white folks. The idea is from the very beginning that we create this white noise that's always around in the ears of African American people. Doesn't matter whether we're in front of them or not. We know that that's the background noise in which African Americans have to constantly negotiate, because that's always a physical sense of threat. It can be expressed finely in birth weights, in life expectancy rates, in what goes on in hospitals, and why we have lead poisoning and things like Flint. And that's all white people showing up. It just is. Showing up by not being there and by living in a segregated environment where you tell your own story about your own life. And the idea is to continue to live that life, never disrupt it. And then to tell yourself one way or another, you have favorable ideas about Black people, you're not prejudiced. And so my purpose is to concentrate on what white people have to deal with about what their ancestors did. The stories of African American people, I would think, and I hope you get further into the literature, there's a tremendous amount now on African American agency that you can read, that you need to know about. The first book I'd give you is a former student of mine who's an African American guy who teaches University of Oklahoma. He's involved in all the Tulsa commemorizations that are going on now that you probably know about. His book is called Beyond the Rope. It's African American Resistance to Lynching. So all I'm saying is the idea that we've gotten this victimization story going, which has been a strong story for a long time, being pushed back against a lot. And if I had a reading list to give you, I'd try and show you what that was. So the purpose of making it white on white is so that we're seeing what our forefathers and foremothers bequeathed us. And it doesn't matter whether you came to, this is why I'm so glad to get away from slavery. Because so many people who look kind of like me can say, well, I wasn't here in the United States when slavery happened. I didn't come until 1880. The post-Reconstruction story, the Reconstruction story, the post-emancipation story is the modern story of the African-American experience. It's not slavery. And the 1619 Project, if you know about that, and all the debates about slavery and freedom and all that, which I interviewed very, very strongly on the side of the New York Times with, in a couple of different editorials that I wrote, is really a diversion from the lived experience in the immediate past of the people who are most oppressed today. So that's why I decided I'd work exclusively on what happened afterwards. And that's why my opening visuals are of Thomas Nast, starting out as an egalitarian and ending up as a white supremacist. You know, it's just a way to be able to frame the story and get it going. But it's about Thomas Nast. It's not about Black people. He showed up, and he continued to show up, and he influenced a lot of people who read his newspaper. So the idea of creating it as white history is, in a sense, what it is. But in a sense, it's also saying that African American history is American history, and that no matter where you slice into it, I happen to slice into it in a certain way, what you're really contacting is the guts and the biggest, hardest themes of what makes our history real.
Yeah, definitely. I think sort of going off of what you just said right now, one thing I have heard recently a lot is people talking about how the legacy of Reconstruction, for example, remains in various systems today, like the law enforcement, incarceration. So one quote that you said across your series, which I think very much stuck with me, was, "We have abolished the slave, but the master remains."
Yeah. That's not my quote. I'm quoting somebody else when I do that. And I'll explain to you who he is.
Yes, and I would like to explore that quote in terms of how I think sometimes white people don't realize that even though slavery ended in 1865, that legacy remains across Jim Crow as well as the modern day. And I think this quote very much speaks to that.
Well, first of all, it's not my quote. I wrote a big, fat, enormous biography of the smartest white abolitionist that ever lived, in my opinion. His name is Wendell Phillips. And Wendell Phillips was, for his time, in a political sense, for white people, David Bowie was to the 80s and 90s. Back then, public entertainment really had to do far less with music than it did with oratory. And this was a guy who was just so incredibly good at public speaking that I can pile up in a pile on my desk dozens and dozens of letters of people writing to each other. I sat there for 3 hours and it felt like 15 minutes. I explain it all in the book how he did it, I hope. But the point is that the moment that the 13th Amendment passed, that's what he said. He saw the 13th Amendment pass, he wanted slavery abolished, and he knew for sure that it wasn't. Exception clause for incarcerated people, you create the loophole that creates all kinds of new forms of slavery by another name, which then you can go look up and find out that there's a Pulitzer Prize-winning history of that by a guy named Douglas Blackman, and then a 2-hour Sundance-winning film about the same thing. And so, yes, you've abolished the slave, but the master remains, and the master remains in a way that turns private forms of labor exploitation based on race into state incarceration, where you make a lot of money for the state by renting out convicts who have been thrown into jail for any good reason that people can figure out, and they buy them and sell them and drive them around with chains on, and it's no different than the old days. Whips, the whole thing. So anyway, you can make the argument that slavery never was abolished, and in that process, it takes place in a world of African American unequal negotiations with whites who are free, who are having to do these annual deals of sharecropping, where the alternative to the negotiation that allows you a certain amount of agency is to cross the man enough that you end up in chains. And that's what that little phrase really means. And it echoes through time and is very, very easily picked up now. You did it. Because it pertains to the present so easily, because that's where structural white supremacy really begins to be able to show itself in a way that you can really sort of capture it and pin it down for a second, because the concept does that. That's at least what I think it does.
Yeah, okay. Definitely. I think a second to last question would be, especially engaging with the history that just happened this, I believe it was this past week on January 6th. I wonder if you can speak a little bit to the difference in even whiteness in the United States, because, like, for example, I grew up in Texas, and the way that history of African Americans is taught in Texas is very
Well, you got the
different.
whole Texas school board to work with. Come on, that's wonderful.
It's very different than the way that African American history is taught in the Northeast, for example. And going to school in the Northeast, I definitely see that difference. And I wonder how you think your message applies to different people, especially some white people in the South might have that history of having ancestors in the Confederacy, for example, or ancestors who had enslaved, ancestors who were enslaving people versus those who were in the North. Because I think what tends to happen is in the North, slavery is seen as something that only occurred in the South, and sort of that history is not engaged in the North, despite the fact that a lot of discrimination happened in the North.
Well, my favorite quote, which shows up, I guess, in the video someplace, is Stokely Carmichael's famous quote. He was a big civil rights activist, very radical in the 1960s. The Mason-Dixon line begins at the Canadian border. And the fact of the matter is that those free states had a century and a half of experience with slavery before they ever became free. They became free very grudgingly. And after that, it's a giant struggle for African American people who are technically free to have any rights at all that anybody is about to respect. And in the 1857 Supreme Court decision that Justice Tonic wrote, where he said black men have no rights that white men are bound to respect, he was arguing that that's a social reality, and he was right. And so the idea that there's some sort of treasury of virtue that northern states and political systems have piled up for themselves because they won the Civil War and their soldiers abolished slavery, and they had abolished slavery sometime between the 1780s and the 1840s. Last slave in Delaware was emancipated in 1861. That's a free state. I mean, it's a complicated history that feeds directly to your observation, which is really correct, that there's a tremendous amount of continuity and overlap between North and South.
I have one last question. Sort of what NAHOF is doing this February is trying to tap into a new medium like videos to reach out to a greater audience. And so you mentioned at some point the reason, the logic behind making your videos is that they're less ephemeral. And it sometimes feels like when you're writing an article, for example, for historians, you're just sort of talking to, you're what is it called? You're speaking to the choir, right? Like you're
right.
Just sort of.
What I'm talking about is preaching past the choir. I'm not interested in whether someone's a Republican or a Democrat. I'm not interested in somebody's opinion on the free market as opposed to socialism. Fundamental questions about humanity and reconciliation are much deeper than how you feel about the Second Amendment. They just are. And if you're all snagged up in that ideological barbed wire, a deeper conversation, which can involve lots of different people that normally can't speak, can get to those basic questions a lot faster. And the idea that white people can't talk about race is absolutely right, because it's all among a lot of different things, including attitudes and secret fears and desires and all that kind of stuff. But it's also tied up with just the plain old problem that we speak politically all the time rather than compassionately. And there's no political judgment in my videos at all, with the exception of saying you get Donald Trump when you get white backlash. After that, there's not a single reference at all, no snide remarks that are designed to put off anybody. I'm supposed to be the most user-friendly human being dispensing history that you could ever possibly want. I don't know if I am or not, but sitting on a couch, being really informal, using all these gestures, I'm playing it again now. You can see me doing it. It's all with the idea of inviting people into a conversation, which can go on just mentally in their head back to me as I'm doing this stuff. But once I get myself involved in things like big Zoom meetings where I've got 40 people, I had a bunch of people actually from right around Saratoga Springs just last night, from a museum up there that's located by, and run by a faculty member at Union College. And by the time you're done doing that, it becomes a conversation that has nothing whatsoever to do with all the shit that people want to throw at you to keep you from being able to deal with it. So the medium is to get past the choir. I mean, I have a bunch of real good friends, and I do it myself. You write for big periodicals. And one of my best friends is a guy named David Blight, who's written a big biography of Frederick Douglass that won the Pulitzer Prize. And once a week, he heroically pulls together 1,800 words for the Wall Street Journal or 1,800 words for Washington Post. And they're beautiful and they're wonderful and they're like a puff of smoke. Because you're right. The problem of transience. And what I would like to do, I'd like to have this be the beginning of a conversation that I have with anybody that you want me to talk to, rather than simply a performance that I've completed right now. My job, because this is what I'm sort of built to do right now, is to mix it up with people and to try in as constructive a way I can and to invite myself into conversations that people might want to have if I'm involved in them.